All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to week number two of PPA 500. I hope you had a good first week of spring 2024 last week. I'm sure we're going to have more people joining us along the way. We've got about half the class here so far, but since you are here at 4 o'clock, we'll go ahead and get started with our session. Thank you very much for your introductory posts. I've gone through and read all of those, so thank you for sharing those introductions. Also, thank you to all of those who were able to do the Constitution pre-assessment. I really do appreciate that. That's going to be very helpful for me moving forward in future semesters to know what I need to cover and what I don't need to cover in terms of the US Constitution. I'm doing that Constitution pre-assessment across all three sections of PPA 500 this semester, including the distance learning section. So really looking forward to seeing how all those results kind of shake out. But again, that was ungraded. The introduction was ungraded as well. The Constitution pre-assessment was also anonymous. So I do appreciate that you took the time to complete that for me. Where we are currently at in the class now is that your first graded Canvas essay is coming due next Monday on February 5th by midnight. And I'd already told you about this one last week, but what this Canvas essay does is it requires that you take a look at Madison's Federalist Paper number 10, which we will discuss in class tonight, and then assess our current situation as a country and whether you think we are more factionalized today than we were back when Madison wrote Federalist Paper number 10. And then what are some strategies that you think we could do to try and control those effects of all the factions that we currently have today in our political culture? I am going to turn off my camera just to try and save some bandwidth tonight. So hopefully I won't buffer or won't get kicked out of the session. So I'm not being rude. I'm just trying to save a little bandwidth by turning off my camera. But again, you've got that Canvas essay number one, which is your first graded one, which is due on Monday. But again, we will cover that information throughout our discussion in class tonight. So before we get into our material for this evening, open it up. Are there any questions about the syllabus or any of the course content that we talked about last week, or any questions about the program in general before we get going tonight? Okay. Okay. If any questions do emerge, as always, just shoot me an email and I'm more than happy to answer any questions that you may have. The way in which I'm envisioning our session tonight is in the first half of class tonight, we will talk about the principles of American government. We'll talk about American government institutions. We will talk about the idea of power in American government. And we're doing all this for the purpose of creating a frame of reference so that we can better understand the role of public administration and public organizations within our institutions and our culture of American government. So essentially what we're trying to do in the first half of class tonight is kind of create an even playing field for everyone in the course, regardless of your previous training or previous courses in American government. I know if you came in as a political science major into the MPA program, all of this information from tonight is kind of old hat. You've been there and done a lot of this before. If you haven't had an American government class for quite some time, then this information I think will be helpful to kind of, again, create that even playing field between everyone for understanding the role of public administration in our system of government. So that's the goal for the first half of class tonight. Then once we're done with that information, we will take a break. And then after our break, we will then turn our attention to the US Constitution. We will go through the 7 articles and 27 amendments in the Constitution, again, with an eye on what the Constitution means for us as public administrators doing our jobs and working within public organizations. As we talk about the US Constitution, we will then also make some references to the California Constitution. Now, we're not going to go through the California Constitution like we're going through the US Constitution because it's just not practical to do so. The California Constitution is, if not the lengthiest, one of the lengthiest and most detailed constitutions in the entire world. We amend the California Constitution very frequently. In fact, we have amended the California Constitution over 500 times. The California Constitution has over 35 articles in it. So it is a massive document. And so it's just not practical for us to go through the California Constitution tonight. But as we go through the US Constitution, I will then draw analogies to the California Constitution and talk about how there are some similarities and some differences between the two documents. So that will be in the second half of our class tonight. So to start out with here in the first half, let's talk American government. And again, we're doing this all with an eye on what it means for public administration and for public administrators and public organizations. Now, a lot of this information you are very familiar with, but you know that our Constitution is essentially a social contract. Our entire governance is based upon this idea of social contract theory. And if you have political science courses in your background, you're probably very familiar with a person by the name of John Locke, a British philosopher. And John Locke, in his second treatise on government, presents us with this idea of a social contract, that essentially power comes from the people, and then people will then decide what powers, what civil liberties, what civil rights to then give up to government. And then government in turn will then exercise those powers judiciously to provide for the welfare of the public. So the social contract is very much a contract between the people and their government. And that's exactly what our Constitution is. Whenever people give up power to government, then it is incumbent upon government to use those powers very judiciously. So we as public administrators, working primarily within government organizations, we are vested with power from citizens, from voters, from taxpayers, and we then have that obligation to use those powers judiciously for the best interests and to promote the best interests of people in society who gave us those powers. Next week in class, in the second part of class next week, we will talk about accountability and ethics. And we'll talk about some of the strategies we can use to hold administrators accountable for how they use that power in a judicious and wise fashion. So since we have a constitution that is a social contract between people and the government, the purpose of that constitution is essentially to limit the powers of government and to be as specific as we can about what powers government will have and how those powers can be used. So our system of government is predicated on this idea of the limitation of government power. And there are two basic pillars of our system of government that help us limit the power of governing organizations. And those pillars, as you all know, separation of powers and federalism. Separation of powers is this horizontal separation of power across branches of government. So the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. In the Constitution, the powers of Congress are laid out in Article 1. The president's powers are laid out in Article 2, and the powers of the Supreme Court as the representative and the sole representative of the judicial branch in the Constitution, those powers are laid out in Article 3. So this whole idea of separating powers horizontally in order to limit power, this balancing of powers, is something that comes to us from Alexander Hamilton. And in several instances throughout the Federalist Papers, Alexander Hamilton talked to us about the importance of doing what he called balancing ambition against ambition. So that's the idea of having these three different branches of government. Now, we also have to recognize that Hamilton's first idea of an executive was a plural executive. And initially, Hamilton wanted to have multiple executives rather than just one executive because he was so concerned about that balancing of power. But the framers settled on the separation of powers with three different branches of government to balance ambition against ambition. And Hamilton talks a lot about that in Federalist Paper number 28. That's not assigned for this class, but just as background information. This idea is primarily oftentimes ascribed to Hamilton in Federalist 28. So we divide up power horizontally across branches of government, And then we also divide power vertically through our system of American federalism. So in the US Constitution, the framers established two different levels of government, a national government and then state governments. That establishment of a national government and state governments is oftentimes referred to as constitutional federalism because it's embodied within the Constitution and it only establishes those two levels of government. Local governments have no standing in the US Constitution. Local governments are not mentioned in the Constitution. They are not given any powers or protections in the Constitution. In our system of federalism, local governments are considered to be creatures of the state. They are created by state governments, they are empowered by state governments, and then if the state government deems it necessary, they can then be abolished by those state governments. The powers and protections that local governments have come primarily from state constitutions as well as from state legislation. This idea of local governments being creatures of the state comes to us from an Iowa judge by the name of Dillon. And Judge Dillon decided in one of his cases that local governments would be creatures of the state. That is what's come to be known as Dillon's Rule. I'll put that in text, Jeff, if you haven't heard about it yet, but it's what's called Dillon's Rule. And it says that local governments are creatures of the state. So when we start talking about local governments in terms of this vertical fragmentation of power, we're not really talking constitutional federalism, but rather we are talking about a term called intergovernmental relations. So we're only talking about national and state, it's constitutional federalism. Once we add local governments in, we then call it intergovernmental relations. I am old enough so that when I was in graduate school, the course I took was a course called federalism. Now, just about all those federalism courses are now called intergovernmental relations, including the intergovernmental relations course that I offer in the summers here in our MPA program. Because local governments have become such integral actors and players in policy formulation and implementation that now we talk intergovernmental relations as opposed to constitutional federalism. But these two basic pillars of separation of powers horizontally and federalism, the fragmentation vertically, those two ideas, those two principles, are both based upon the idea of limiting the power of government. Again, we need to limit the power of government because power comes from the people. So by limiting the power of government, we are providing protections to individual citizens, which then leads us to the type of government we have here in America. And we oftentimes like to talk about our system of government as being a democracy. We go around the world and we promote democracy to other nations around the world. And we always point out that we're one of the longest currently existing democracies in the world. Yes, indeed, we do have democratic elements to our system of government. But if you really want to characterize our system of government more accurately, we are really what you would consider to be a democratic republic. And you've probably heard that quote 1,000 times from Ben Franklin before. But when Ben Franklin was asked, what type of a government did you create? And he said, a republic if we can keep it. Because we have both elements of a democracy as well as elements of a republic. So my question to you to start out tonight is, what is a democracy? How do we know if a government is truly a democracy? What does democracy mean? Now, open it up to you. You can use text chat, you can use your microphone, however you're comfortable participating. But what do we mean by the term democracy? Okay, let's see. Citizens directly vote on issues. Exactly. I couldn't say it better myself. In a democracy, citizens vote on issues. Citizens participate directly in decision making. They participate directly in their own self-determination and their own self-governance. That's what a democracy is. Some of our states have more democratic elements than other states. We are all fortunate here in California that the state of California provides us with a lot of different avenues for putting issues on the ballot and for voting on and directly deciding upon issues. A couple of those different processes are what are known as initiatives and referenda. We have both initiatives as well as referenda here in the state of California. With an initiative, we essentially have a process whereby voters can go out there and they can collect signatures to force an issue onto the ballot. Now, here in California, as of 2011, I think it was, statewide initiatives can only appear on general election ballots. So if you're going to go out there and collect signatures to put an issue on the ballot, it will appear on a statewide general election ballot. So if you go out there and you collect enough signatures, you can then force the issue onto the ballot to then be decided directly by the voters. So that is a democratic type of an approach. We are kind of bypassing the state legislature. We're bypassing elected officials. We as citizens are deciding what we will vote on at the ballot box in an upcoming election. In order to get an issue on the ballot here in California, you need to get a certain number of signatures. And it depends upon whether the initiative is for a constitutional amendment or if the initiative is for changing legislation, existing law. If your initiative will amend the Constitution, then you need to get enough signatures equal to 8% of the voters who voted in the last gubernatorial election. So currently, in order to get that number of signatures, you would have to get about 875,000 signatures. And that's what you would be required to get in order to force that constitutional amendment onto the ballot. If, however, your initiative is not affecting the Constitution, it's just changing a law or changing the way in which a law is going to be implemented, then the bar is lower. In that instance, you only need to get 5% of the voters who voted in the last gubernatorial elections. So that would be somewhere around about 546,000 or something like that. So it is a lower bar for that type of initiative. So you circulate the petitions, you get your signatures. Those petitions then go to the Secretary of State's office. The Secretary of State's office will then review those petitions. They will do a random check of those names to make sure that all those names on the petition are registered voters at the address that they say that they list there on the petition. And you can't obviously check all 800,000 or 500,000 signatures. So they'll do a random sample of signatures. They will then verify those signatures and see what percentage of those signatures are valid. So say, 80% of those signatures are valid. They will then extrapolate that 80% to all the rest of the signatures on that petition. So if you got 600,000 signatures and 80% from the random sample are valid, then 480,000 signatures will then be verified. That obviously would then not be enough in order to get that issue on the ballot. So it's always important that if you're going to do an initiative, you go out there and you get a lot more signatures than what you think you need. And again, they need to be registered voters, registered at the address in which they are listing on that petition. But that's an initiative where you can force issues onto the ballot. Then there's also a referendum process. The referendum process oftentimes comes out of the state legislature. And so the state legislature may say, this is an issue that is so important to voters that we as elected officials, we don't really want to make that decision, or maybe we can't make that decision because we can't get agreement on it. So instead, we will put a referendum before the voters. And the state legislature will then put an issue on the ballot, and then the voters will vote on that issue at the next election. So that's what's referred to as a referendum. Here in California, we have both initiatives as well as referenda. Not every state has those processes. So the more of those processes you have, the lower the bar to get issues on the ballot, the more kind of democratic, purely democratic approach you are taking in that state. So how democratic we are in how we make our decisions is going to vary between states. And that's kind of the common theme of our system of American federalism. We have 50 different states. Those 50 different states oftentimes take 50 different approaches to issues. And so that type of fragmentation from our system of federalism is what gives us that variation in the amount of democratic processes we see from one state to another. But that's exactly true, that a democracy is where citizens directly make decisions and vote on issues. But in addition to being a democracy, we are also a republic. We are also a Republican, lower R form of government, which means that we elect officials to go and represent us and make decisions for us. And we do that in terms of, obviously, members of the US Senate. There's a very big Senate election coming up in our primary in March. We do that with members of the House of Representatives, members of the California Assembly, members of the California State Senate, city councils, local school boards, regional water districts. We go out there and we elect people to represent us. When you're electing people to represent you, that is a Republican form of government. And so, again, we are a democratic republic in the way in which our government is designed, in the way in which our government operates. That is important to us as public administrators because there can be a lot of independent influences placed upon us by what happens at the ballot box. And so if voters decide to change the Constitution and amend the Constitution like they've done over 500 times here in the state of California, we as public administrators need to be up to date on what those changes mean and what those changes say. Because as public administrators, we have qualified good faith immunity, which means that we are expected to know and protect the constitutional rights of people that we come into contact with. So first, we need to know what their constitutional rights are. So those types of constitutional amendments that we see at the ballot box will have a big impact upon what we do as public administrators. And then also the political parties that are elected will have an impact upon us as public administrators as well. Whether it's a administration from one party or the other party could have a very big impact on the amount of funding that we get in our agencies, could have a very big impact upon the amount of flexibility and discretion we have in making decisions on a daily basis, could have a big impact upon whether or not we continue to be civil servants and whether or not we continue to have this qualified good faith immunity. I know one of the planks of the platform, if you will, for the Trump campaign for 2024 is to remove civil service status from the vast majority of federal employees. That obviously will have a big impact upon public administrators and the public sector. So it's important for us to understand these concepts of being a democratic republic. There are a lot of countries around the world that call themselves democracies that are not truly democracies. There are a lot of countries around the world that call themselves a republic that are not republics. But we do kind of combine both of those elements together into our form of government. But again, that form of government then is embodied within this social contract known as our Constitution. And I had you read the Articles of Confederation. I didn't really expect you to memorize them or spend a whole lot of time on them, but just kind of get a sense and flair of what that first Constitution said. And the Articles of Confederation served as our first Constitution in this country. But it is important for us also, before we talk about the Articles of Confederation, to understand that the language that we use today is different than the language that was used by the framers. So this whole word confederation in the Articles of Confederation, a confederation today for us means something different than it meant for the framers. Basically, the word confederation, when it's used by us, is similar to the word federation that was used by the framers. Whenever we think about a confederation, we think about all these different autonomous sovereign entities, whether it be states or provinces or whatever they are, all these sovereign entities that retain their own sovereignty. That's what we think about when we think about a confederation. The framers, when they talked about it, a confederation to them usually meant what we would talk about today as a federal form of government or a federation. So when you're reading some of the Federalist Papers, especially Federalist Paper number 39, and you see Madison talk about our system of government as being either national or federal, he's basically, when he says federal, he's basically saying confederal. He's basically using that as the same way as we would use the word confederation today. But one of the major problems with a confederation is that all of the members of that confederation, all the members of that union, are all sovereign entities and they all retain their own power. So sometimes it becomes difficult for the national government to get those component members to do what the national government wants them to do. Whenever you have a confederation, you typically have a relatively weak national government. And that was one of the primary problems with the Articles of Confederation that were agreed to after the Revolutionary War. So, with this idea of a confederation, as the Articles of Confederation say, all of the states that joined in that confederation, all of those states are essentially sovereign entities. And the Articles of Confederation, you probably noticed, referred to it as a firm league of friendship. So the Articles of Confederation created a nation that was a firm league of friendship. All these states agreed to join together in this confederation as a league of friendship. So one state will help out another state if that state needs help. A firm league of friendship is obviously a much weaker phrase than a unified country. And I think that kind of just is symbolic of the whole nature of this confederation under the Articles. In fact, when you read through the Articles, one thing that you will probably notice is that the United States of America, as a proper noun, capitalized and as a proper noun, is used only in the part of the Articles where it says the style of this confederation shall be the United States of America. And by style, they mean the name. So basically, they're saying the name of our confederation is the United States of America, capitalized proper noun. And that's about the only time you're going to see it used as a proper noun in the Articles of Confederation. Throughout the rest of the Articles, whenever the United States is mentioned, it's usually mentioned as the United States in Congress assembled. That's a really important passage. The United States in Congress assembled. In the Articles of Confederation, when they talked about the word Congress, they didn't think about it the way we do today. Today, when you think about Congress, we think about a permanent institution. And we think about Capitol Hill and the Capitol building and the office buildings. We think of a permanent institution. Under the Articles, Congress is not being used as a permanent institution. Congress is being used as a meeting. And another way in which you can define Congress is a meeting. So tonight we are having a Congress of PPA 500. We're having a meeting of PPA 500. So essentially in that passage is saying we are the United States. The states are united when they are meeting, when they are in Congress assembled. So when all the delegates from the states get together in this Congress, they get together in this meeting, that's when we are the United States. However, those delegates are going to finish their work and then go back home to their states. So it wasn't a permanent type of situation like we think about it today. There really wasn't any independent executive. We essentially had more or less a unibranch government. We had a Congress, and that was essentially it. The Congress was unicameral in that we didn't have a House and a Senate. We had one Congress, one meeting of the states. States would send delegates to this Congress, to this meeting. And then if the delegates didn't like what was going on at that meeting, they could literally just pick up their marbles and go home. They could just say, I'm going back to Virginia. I'm going back to South Carolina. And they could just leave. And it's really hard to get anything done when you have a bunch of delegates saying, we don't like what's going on, so we're just simply going to go home. There wasn't a standing army, and there was very little in the way of national defense that was being provided by the Articles of Confederation. Even though Congress had the ability to coin currency, we still had a situation where we had all these different states using their own currency. You can imagine how difficult interstate commerce is. When you have different states using different forms of currency, it makes commerce almost impossible. But one of the overarching problems with the Articles of Confederation is if we recognize that there was a problem in the Articles and we wanted to amend the Articles of Confederation, the only way to amend the Articles was with a unanimous vote of all of the states. So you had to have all states come together and all agree to the amendment before you could amend the Articles of Confederation. Well, we all know how difficult it is to get people to agree upon where they want to go to eat lunch. So imagine how difficult it would be to get all the states to agree to amending the Articles. So even though you had all these fatal flaws in the Articles, it was next to impossible to change them through the amendment process. So we had all these problems with the Articles of Confederation that kind of boiled down to the creation of a very weak national government where states really retained their own sovereignty and retained their own power. One of the theories that you will talk about when you get to your PPA 670 policy analysis class is in policy formulation, the importance of what we consider to be a triggering event, or something happens, some big triggering event happens that opens up a policy window that makes it possible for us to make a big change to our public policies. For the most part in this country, it's always been this way, our policies tend to be very incremental in that there are only very small changes to our policies from one year to the next. However, when a big event happens, it galvanizes public opinion around the idea that we need to make a change to the way in which we're addressing this problem or this issue. We saw that with September 11th. September 11th occurred. It was a triggering event that caused the federal government to create a Department of Homeland Security and to create a TSA and to place all these limitations in terms of how you travel by air. And then ended up creating this Real ID Act, whereby all the states have to adopt this Real ID. All these major changes to Homeland Security came about as a result of that triggering event. Well, a similar thing kind of happened with the Articles of Confederation. There was discontent about the Articles. People recognized some of the problems with the Articles, most notably the lack of power for the national government. But we ended up having this triggering event referred to as Shays' Rebellion. And actually, it was not just one rebellion, it was a series of rebellions of farmers who were losing their farms. And they were losing their farms because essentially their farms were being foreclosed upon for the non payment of taxes. And so, since they were losing their farms and losing their livelihood, you had these farmers who were then rebelling. One of the most notable rebellions was one in Massachusetts that was led by a retired Army captain by the name of Daniel Shays. Daniel Shay. And so Daniel Shay actually becomes kind of the face of these series of rebellions that were going on. The problem was that you had these farmers being led by a retired Army captain who were leading a rebellion against a state armory. And it took a while to put this rebellion down. And it really raised a lot of concerns on the part of citizens when they looked at it and said, if we cannot put down a rebellion of a bunch of farmers led by a retired Army captain, what are we going to do if we have a foreign nation coming over and attacking us again? And so there's a lot of concern for a lack of national defense. That concern then led to the Constitutional Convention. The Constitutional Convention was originally designed to just merely amend the Articles. Again, remember, to amend the Articles, you had to have unanimous vote of all the states. So we pull all the states together in this Constitutional Convention for the purpose of amending the Articles in order to strengthen national defense. And that was the primary purpose of the Constitutional Convention. However, at the Constitutional Convention, some delegates arrived earlier than others. And you think about the condition of the nation's roads. They certainly weren't paved, they were muddy roads, and some delegates were able to get there before other delegates were. The delegates who were able to get to the convention first were oftentimes what we consider to be the Federalists. The Federalists believed in replacing this article of Constitution with a brand new Constitution. They felt that we needed more from the national government than just national defense. and that we needed more than just to amend the articles. Those Federalists tended to get to the convention first, and led by people like James Madison, they were able to get the ball rolling toward not just amending the articles, but completely replacing the articles with this brand new Constitution. And so by the time some of the anti-Federalists, people like Sherman and others, got to the convention, the ball was already rolling downhill toward getting rid of the articles and coming up with this brand new Constitution. At this Constitutional Convention, you essentially had three main conflicts that were going on at the Constitutional Convention that then formed the basis for the Constitution that emerged from that Constitutional Convention. The Constitution itself is a series of compromises. It's a series of compromises between large states and small states, slave states and non-slave states, and these aforementioned Federalists and anti-Federalists. So to get the agreement on a new Constitution, the framers had to put a lot of compromises into this new document. So one of the first conflicts we have is a conflict between large states and small states. So we had some very large states, states like New York and Virginia and Pennsylvania, that were very populous, that had a lot of revenue, had a lot of commerce going on. And then you had your smaller states, states such as New Jersey and Rhode Island, and those smaller states that were much less populous. Large states obviously wanted to have proportional representation in Congress. So they said, as we create this new Congress, we want to have people elected to Congress based upon the area they come from. And so if Virginia would have more representatives in Congress than New Jersey would have, they believed in proportional representation. Obviously, smaller states like New Jersey were scared to death of proportional representation because it means that they would be outnumbered in Congress. So they wanted equal representation. The Virginia plan called for proportional representation. The New Jersey plan called for equal representation. And we end up with the great compromise that you are all familiar with, also known as the Connecticut Compromise. Let's create a bicameral legislature where we will create a House of Representatives as the lower house of Congress, a Senate as the upper house of Congress. The lower house of Congress, the House, will be proportional representation. The upper house, the Senate, will be equal representation. That is a clear compromise to balance the interests of large states versus small states. And that's what gives us this bicameral two-house type of legislature. And we see that play out in Article 1 of the Constitution. The second major conflict, obviously, was a more difficult one to deal with and one that the framers were unable to resolve. And that's the slave state versus non-slave state conflict. Representatives from slave states really wanted to see this institution of slavery embodied within the Constitution. They wanted the institution of slavery placed within the Constitution to freeze it as an institution, to make it permanent. You had some others, such as Alexander Hamilton, who fought very hard against that and fought very hard against having the institution of slavery incorporated within the Constitution. So what the slave states and non-slave states did is they came to a compromise, a couple of compromises. And again, these are compromises that obviously today we wish they would not have come to, but these are compromises in the way in which the framers thought they could deal, at least temporarily, with this conflict between slave and non-slave states. The first one in Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution was the 3/5 compromise that for the purposes of representation in the House, enslaved individuals would be considered as 3/5 of a free person for the purposes of representation. And then in Article 1, Section 9, they put in a clause that prohibited banning the slave trade until at least the year 1808. So essentially what the framers did is they kicked the can down the road. They said, we're going to let future generations deal with this issue of slavery. We cannot deal with it here because we deal with it here, we're not going to get agreement on this new Constitution. Not to mention that when you think about the demographic profile of the delegates at the Constitutional Convention, the delegates of the Constitutional Convention were all white, they were male, and they were property owners. And for those white male property owners in the South, they were oftentimes also slave owners. Uh, we know Thomas Jefferson was a slave owner, George Washington was a slave owner. James Madison inherited a plantation with 100 slaves from his father. Over the course of his life, he only freed one of those 100 slaves. And so they were slave owners themselves. So obviously, what the framers did with their compromise in this regard is they set the stage then for the Civil War. And we would then fight this battle out for decades leading up to the Civil War, and then have the Civil War for 4 years where hundreds of thousands of Americans lost their lives. So, whereas I think they did an admirable job dealing with the first conflict, obviously dealing with the second conflict was a miserable failure. The third conflict we had was this conflict between Federalists and Anti-Federalists. Again, the Federalists believed in a stronger national government. Anti-Federalists believed in state sovereignty. When the Anti-Federalists came to the Constitutional Convention, they were only willing to admit that they wanted to strengthen the national government enough in order to provide national defense. And that's all they wanted to do, is they just wanted to find a way that the national government could provide stronger national defense. Federalists, such as James Madison, knew that they had to get the Anti-Federalists to agree that they actually wanted more out of the national government than just providing stronger national defense. Again, when you think about the demographic profile of these delegates who are white male property owners, these are the individuals who were the creditors in society. They were the ones who had loaned the money in order to make the Revolutionary War possible. They obviously wanted to get their money back. Madison realized that, and he knew that that was a nerve that he could press on the Anti-Federalists. And if he could get the Anti-Federalists to agree that they wanted more out of this national government than just national defense, that they wanted the national government to have some economic regulatory power so that they could get their debts repaid, once he got them to admit to that, the articles were dead. There was no going back. The articles were dead and gone. Everyone knew that we were going to have this new constitution. But we had to balance the interests of Federalists versus Anti-Federalists in this Constitution. So the framers did that in a number of different ways. One way in which they did it is in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, as we'll see in the second half of class tonight, lays out the powers of Congress. In Article 1, Section 8, we have several enumerated powers of Congress. So Congress has the ability to declare war. Congress has the ability to regulate interstate commerce. Congress has the ability to coin money. Congress, the Senate, has the ability to ratify treaties. Congress has the ability to establish post offices. Congress has the ability to issue patents, and so on and so on. All those specific powers of Congress are referred to as the enumerated powers of Congress. Whenever you enumerate something, whenever you list something, you are by definition limiting power, because the assumption is everything that is then not listed in Article 1, Section 8 is a power that does not belong to Congress, that does not belong to the national government. So the Anti-Federalists were very happy to see all these specific enumerated powers, because it meant that everything else in the universe would then belong, they thought, to state governments. However, at the end of Article 1, Section 8, we have this elastic clause that I'm sure you have heard about before. Sometimes it's called the necessary and proper clause, that Congress shall have the power to basically do whatever is necessary and proper to carry into execution all those enumerated powers that were listed in Article 1, Section 8. They can do anything that they deem to be necessary and proper that allows them to carry out their enumerated powers. That elastic clause has been part of the Constitution that Congress has used over the years to expand its power over the states. Congress will say, well, this is necessary and proper that we do this. It is necessary and proper that we do this. And it's really been a tool that they've been able to use to expand their power. So right there in Article 1, Section 8, we kind of have a conflict. We have these specific enumerated powers, and then we have this very broad grant of power to Congress and the national government to do whatever is necessary and proper. Article 6, Paragraph 2 of the Constitution then talks about this supremacy clause. So the framers got this supremacy clause into the Constitution, the Federalists really, that said that the Constitution and laws and treaties of the United States are the supreme law of the land. That's a very strong pronouncement of national government power. That essentially, when state constitutions and state laws come into conflict with the national constitution and national laws, the national constitution and national laws will win. That was a very much of a Federalist passage that got included in the Constitution. So much so that it became difficult to get a certain state to ratify the Constitution. So once the Constitution was then adopted in the convention, it then had to be ratified. And it had to be ratified by 9 out of 13 states before it would go into effect. Very soon after the Constitution was adopted, we had a 14th state that came into the Union, which was Vermont. And so then instead of 9 out of 13, it became 10 out of 14 states in order to ratify the Constitution. The problem was that you had anti-federalists who were very concerned that this Constitution was creating too strong of a national government and that the national government would tread upon the sovereignty of state governments. You also had those anti-federalists in the state of New York who were also dragging their feet for ratification. So very quickly, within 2 years, we ended up with 10 states that ratified the Constitution. So it happened relatively quickly. Once those states ratified the Constitution, technically the Constitution went into effect. The problem was that New York was not one of those states. New York was the linchpin of commerce. So commerce really flowed through New York, through the port of New York. So if you did not have New York as part of this union, you basically had nothing in terms of commerce. And so the framers knew they needed to get New York to buy into this new constitution and get the citizens of New York to ratify this new constitution. That's why we ended up getting the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, as well as these 85 Federalist Papers that were written by Hamilton, Madison, and Jay. So in terms of the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, initially there were supposed to be 12 amendments in the Bill of Rights. So it's supposed to consist of 12 amendments. 2 of those amendments failed to get ratified by 3/4 of states. And so only 10 of the 12 ended up getting ratified. One of the amendments that failed to get ratified was an amendment by James Madison that would limit the ability of Congress to receive a raise in compensation until they stood for an ensuing election. So if Congress voted itself a raise, they would have to then wait until the next ensuing election and get reelected before they would then be able to get that raise. Again, it was meant to try and hold them accountable to the people. That amendment did not get enough states to ratify it until 1992. And we'll talk about that when we talk about the Constitution. But that amendment eventually became the 27th Amendment to the Constitution, finally ratified by enough states in 1992. And then the other amendment that did not get enough states to ratify it was an amendment that would have limited the size of congressional districts, the size of House of Representative districts, to 50,000 residents, and that any one congressional district could not have more than 50,000 citizens. It's probably a good thing that did not get ratified, because if it would have been ratified, given today's population, instead of 435 members of the House of Representatives, you would have about 4,300 members of the House of Representatives. And so if you think it's hard enough to get something done with 435 people, think about getting things done with 4,300 people. So it's probably good that it didn't get ratified. But 10 of those 12 amendments did get ratified and become the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments of the Constitution. And again, they were designed in order to try and allay the concerns of the anti-federalists that the national government would be too powerful. And the one that we have on the screen there is the Reserve Powers Amendment. That is the 10th Amendment to the Constitution. And the Reserve Powers Amendment says that all powers that are not given to Congress in the Constitution nor deprived to the states belong to the states and the people. And so basically it's reiterating that if a power is not given to Congress explicitly in the Constitution, that power then belongs to state governments. Very much of a nod to anti-federalists who very much believed in state sovereignty and states' rights. As we said, in addition to that, in order to get the Constitution ratified, Hamilton, Madison, and Jay then wrote these 85 Federalist Papers. Madison wrote 29 of them, Hamilton wrote 51, and Jay wrote 5 because Jay became ill after writing 5 and could not write anymore. All these Federalist Papers are written for the purpose of convincing the citizens of New York to ratify this new Constitution. So they were all written in order to convince the citizens of New York that this Constitution would not create too powerful of a national government, that this new Constitution, this new national government is nothing to be afraid of. You've seen it before. It's similar to what you currently have in your states. It is something that you should ratify and not be afraid of ratifying. Of those 85 Federalist Papers, some have become more famous than others. They were all written under the pseudonym of Publius, and so originally we didn't know who wrote each of them. Over the years, we certainly have figured it out, and so we know who wrote what. Of those Federalist Papers, there are 2 of them that I pulled out for our purposes in this class to take a look at. One of them is Federalist number 10, and that's the one that you will be using as the basis for your Canvas essay that's due next Monday. I hope you have a chance to take a look at Federalist number 10. In Federalist number 10, James Madison talks about the impact of what he says are factions. So Madison really believed very strongly in the idea of what became known as a compound republic. If I can type and talk at the same time, I'll put that in text chat. A compound republic. And please forgive if I have a typos in text chats because I'm trying to multitask and talk and type at the same time. But this idea of a compact republic, it was, all pun intended, a revolutionary idea at the time. Philosophers and the prevailing philosophical thought about governments back then was that the most efficient way to organize a government was through what the philosophers referred to as a compact republic. And one of the philosophers best known for that is a philosopher by the name of Montesquieu. So Montesquieu argued that we needed a compact republic. We needed to keep the republic small. We needed to keep the population relatively homogeneous, because the smaller it is and the more that people share similar ideas and similar opinions, the more efficient it will be to operate that government. And that was very much the prevailing political thought of the time. Madison argued the opposite. He said that we should have a compound republic, whereby in this compound republic, you have a lot of people with different ideas and different opinions. We can then balance opinion against opinion. Madison basically made the argument that anytime you have a democracy will breed conflict. Because in a democracy, people can voice their own opinions, and one opinion will come into conflict with another opinion. So conflict is a necessary artifact of a democratic system of government. As such, he said that we cannot eliminate factions. If you eliminate factions, you're basically eliminating individual thought, and you're eliminating the ability of someone to hold an opinion. He says we can't eliminate factions, but the best thing we can do is to control their effects. And we can best control their effects by balancing faction against faction. And by balancing faction against faction, no one faction will become too powerful. And so therefore we can allow all these different opinions in this very compound republic and still be able to operate this government. That was, again, a revolutionary thought at the time, this whole idea of a compound republic. But that's really what Madison believed in, and that really is kind of the underpinning of our Constitution. Now, the question that you're going to be dealing with in your Canvas essay is, do you think we are more factionalized today than we were in Madison's time? And then what do you think we can do to better control factions? I believe that it is much different today in that we have a lot of disparity among factions in terms of wealth and resources. If you want to liken a faction to an interest group, there are some interest groups in this country that are extremely powerful. Interest groups can get their power from the size of their membership, such as an AARP, the Association for the Advancement of Retired Persons. Sometimes interest groups can get their power from the types of members that they have, such as the American Bar Association or the American Medical Association. Sometimes these interest groups can get their power through resources in that they are able to raise money and then use that money in elections in order to shape the decisions being made by elected officials. And I do think today that there's a lot more disparity in wealth between these factions than perhaps what we saw in Madison's time. But I do want you to think about our current situation with factions and compare it to Madison's. And then what do you think we could do as a modern society to try and address the issue of factions? Because the more factions you have and the more unequal factions you have, the more likelihood that a few factions will dominate. And a few factions will then run a tyranny over those factions that have less resources and less wealth. One of my favorite Federalist papers is Federalist Paper number 39, again, written by James Madison. And in Federalist Paper number 39, I think Madison does a very nice job of kind of deconstructing the Constitution. He pulls the Constitution apart into its component elements, and he basically asks the question, is the Constitution national or is the Constitution federal? By national, he's asking the question, is the Constitution centralizing power in the national government? By federal, he's saying, is the Constitution protecting the sovereignty of state governments and decentralizing and devolving power down to the state government level? And so what he does, kind of thinking like a social scientist, is he takes the Constitution and breaks it up into its component elements. And so the first thing he says is, let's think about how the Constitution was created. Who created the Constitution? Well, he answers that question as the states created the Constitution. The states sent delegates that were representing each individual state to the Constitutional Convention. The states really created this Constitution. The states really created this union. So in terms of the creation of the Constitution, it is very federal in nature in that it really respected state sovereignty, and the states took an active role in creating the Constitution. After all, the states came first. The states were around before the national government was around. Indeed, some elements of the Constitution are based directly upon state constitutions. He essentially says, don't be afraid of this new Constitution because it's a whole lot like the Constitution you currently have in your state. The 4-year terms for the president, those 4-year terms are very similar to the terms of many governors. In fact, some governors have 6-year terms. And so you shouldn't be afraid of the president having too much power because of having a 4-year term. He talks about how we elect people to serve in Congress. And whereas the House of Representatives is popularly elected, under the Constitution, members of the Senate were selected by state legislatures. So again, it's kind of a combination. National in terms of the way in which people are selected in the House, and federal in terms of the way in which people are selected to serve in the Senate. So it's a combination of the two. It says, well, let's think about the operations of government. Who will be responsible for the day-to-day operations? Well, essentially public administrators. He didn't use the term public administrators, but he's essentially saying individual employees. Individual bureaucrats are going to be the ones responsible for the operation of government. So that one, he kind of throws his hands up and says, okay, since they are individuals, it's more national in nature. There's not a whole lot of role for the states to play in terms of these individual public administrators. However, do not fear, because when you look at the extent of power in this new government will be, again, a balance between national and state governments. State governments will have a lot of influence on Congress in terms of what Congress does. States will also have a big influence on the president through the use of the electoral college. And so it's really kind of this nice balance between national and federal. It says, well, we know under the Articles of Confederation, they were nearly impossible to amend. Well, here under this new Constitution, it's much easier to amend the Constitution And the amendment process is, again, a combination of a national and a federal approach. In order to amend the Constitution, you have to have a proposal of an amendment by 2/3 of the House and the Senate. That's national in nature. However, for that amendment to be ratified, it needs to be ratified by 3/4 of state legislatures. That is federal in nature. That provides states an integral role in determining which amendments get in and do not get in to this Constitution. So again, with amendments, it's a balance. And the conclusion he comes to is that don't fear this new Constitution. It's very similar to what you currently have in your state. And also don't fear this new Constitution because it's a perfect balance of the national with the federal. There are enough provisions in this Constitution to protect the sovereignty of state governments and make sure that the national government does not become overly powerful and does not become too onerous, if you will, in terms of how it deals with state governments. So it's a really nice balance between the national and the federal. I think it's a compelling argument, but obviously when you read these Federalist Papers, you have to read them with the perspective that Hamilton and Madison primarily were writing these Federalist Papers to convince people to support the Constitution. So they were very much of a, if you want to say, a sales pitch. They were trying to sell this new Constitution to the citizens of New York and to the anti-Federalists. And so they certainly had, I won't say an axe to grind, but they certainly had a goal that they were trying to achieve in writing those Federalist Papers. The combination of the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments of the Constitution, and the Federalist Papers were ended up being that the citizens of New York ratified the new Constitution. New York signed on to the Constitution, and we had a Constitution that was then able to go into effect and to truly function on an everyday basis. Again, there are a lot of nuances in the Constitution, and we'll talk about those in the second half of class tonight. And the Constitution really is a series of compromises, and all those compromises are built around this idea of power. From the very first slide an hour ago tonight, we talked about our system of government being based upon a limitation of power, limiting the power of government. We talked about how the anti-federalists were concerned that the national government would have too much power. And so that's why they were dragging their feet in ratifying this new Constitution. So we have talked a lot about power so far tonight, but we haven't really delved into the idea of power and really talked about what power really is. So my question to you is, give me a really quick, brief definition of what is power. What does power mean to you? I think if you got 10 political scientists into a room, you'd end up with 10 different definitions of power. So there's no right answer to this. But when you think about the word power, what do you think about? What is power? Ability to control, Juan says. Absolutely. The power is the ability to control others, the ability to influence others to do something you want them to do that perhaps they otherwise would not do. And I think a pretty basic, a good definition of power is the ability to influence someone to do something they otherwise would not do. If you're able to do that, you are then exercising power. And oftentimes when we're exercising power, we are using resources to influence people to do something they otherwise would not do. Again, I think that's a good basic definition of power, but in all my classes, I kind of like to delve a little bit deeper into it. And there is a famous social scientist by the name of John Gaventa. And if any of you have a sociology background, you may have heard about John Gaventa before. I put his name in his text chat. But John Gaventa was really fascinated by this idea of power. And being a good social scientist, he decided he wanted to do some case studies in which he could get a better sense of what the term power really is and how power actually was being exercised in real life situations. So he went into coal mining towns in the states of Kentucky and Tennessee, these very rural coal mining towns. And he wanted to understand why the coal mine owners were able to get the coal miners to do things that were obviously not in their own self-interest. Things such as working 80-hour weeks in these mines, working in very dangerous mine conditions. If you know anything about coal mining, coal mines tend to have this tendency to explode, and you release gases when you're doing the coal mining, and then if there's any type of ignition, any type of a flame hits those gases, the mine explodes. So it's a very, very dangerous place to work. Even years ago, there was this process known as the dusting of the mine. And so, what you would do in order to tamp down the chances of explosion, you would dust the mine. Then you would dust the mine and powder the mine. And by dusting and powdering the mine, you would then keep the gases from seeping out and make it less likely that they would hit a flame and then explode. Dusting the mine cost the mine owners money. And so mine owners didn't want to dust the mines. And so they rarely dusted the mines. And so workers were working in a very unsafe environment for 80 hours per week. On top of that, these coal miners were not getting paid with money. They'd work 80 hours a week, and at the end of the week, they would get paid with tokens. Those tokens could only be used in the company store. So if they had to go and get groceries and supplies, they would have to go to the company store owned by the coal mine and then use these tokens to purchase what they need for their daily lives. The coal mine owners essentially were exercising power over just about every aspect of the miners' lives. And what Gavetta wanted to know is, why were the miners standing for that? Why were they okay with that? And so through his study of these different case studies, he came up with 3 different faces of power, essentially a 3-part typology of power. According to Gavetta, the first face or type of power is what I like to call overt power. He didn't really use the term overt. I use the term overt. In this first face of power, it's what he considers to be the least dangerous type of power. Because with overt power, both parties know that power is being exercised. So if you're in the army and you're the sergeant and you tell a private, go run this obstacle course. The private may not want to run the obstacle course, but he has to because the sergeant is telling him to. The sergeant knows he's exercising power. The private knows that power is being exercised over them. Both parties know what's going on. And so it makes it the least dangerous type of power, according to Gaventa. Second type of power is what he calls a mobilization of bias. Mobilization of bias is what you'll talk about in your policy class as agenda setting. In mobilization of bias, one party is able to set the agenda of decision making. So what was going on is that the coal mine owners, they were using their money through campaign donations to the elected officials in the Kentucky state legislature and the Tennessee state legislature to keep those legislatures from considering mine safety legislation. So mine safety legislation might get introduced, but it never makes it to the floor of the legislature. They never pass it, never goes to the governor's office. Nothing is ever done about mine safety because the coal mine owners could use campaign donations to make sure nothing happened. That's mobilization of bias. This one is more dangerous because as the coal mine owners were setting the agenda of the state legislature, the coal mine workers only knew that this legislation wasn't being passed. They didn't know why, they just knew it wasn't happening. So they didn't realize that the coal mine owners were effectively setting the agenda of the state legislature. And that's what makes it more dangerous because one party doesn't know what is going on and doesn't know power is being exercised. Then the third and the most dangerous form of power, according to Gaventa, is what he calls co-optation. In co-optation, this is where one party in the relationship co-opts the opinion of another party. In other words, one party will then replace the other party's opinion with their own. And so in this co-optation, the coal mine owners were able to co-opt the opinions of the coal mine workers by convincing them that it was in the coal mine workers' best interest to do what was in the best interest of the coal mine company. So it was in your best interest to work 80 hours per week. It was in your best interest for us not to dust the mine. It was in your best interest to get paid with tokens instead of getting paid with money. Once you're able to co-opt the opinion of someone else, this is very dangerous because the other person doesn't know you've done it. They just are, they now have an opinion that is counter to their own self-interest, but they don't even realize it. That's why co-optation is so dangerous of a face of power. I like Gaventa's typology because it gives us a much more nuanced definition of what power is. There are different types of power. There are different ways in which power is exercised. Sometimes that power is very clear and very upfront, like in that drill sergeant example. Sometimes it's more hidden in terms of setting the agenda through campaign contributions. And sometimes it's even more hidden and downright insidious in terms of the ability to co-opt others' opinions. I would ask that you just kind of hold on to this Gaventa typology for a while, because as we proceed through tonight as well as future classes, we're going to continue to talk about the term power in public administration. And at some points in time, you will see this power exercised as agenda setting. Sometimes you'll see it exercised in terms of a clear, direct exercise of power. At other times, you'll see it used in terms of co-optation. In fact, very soon, we're going to talk about the idea of federalism. And when we talk about federalism, we're going to talk about things the national government did, such as direct order mandates, where the national government will directly order a state to do something. That's an example of the use of overt power. Congress will say, we have the constitutional ability to tell you to do this, and so we're going to tell you to do this. And if you don't do it, we are then going to fine you. You're going to get civil fines or criminal penalties, but we are going to apply some punitive measure if you don't do what we told you to do. That's an example of the first face of power, the example of overt power. Sometimes state governments will not like the types of mandates that the national government imposes upon them, and so they will try and get Congress to undo those mandates. Well, sometimes Congress won't even consider doing it. They won't even put it on their agenda. That's mobilization of bias, and that's agenda setting. So there'll be a lot of examples as we go through the class where we'll look at what type of power is this. So keep these three different types of power in mind, because power really is very much that multi-dimensional type of term where you can use different types of power to influence people to do what you want them to do. Originally, I was thinking we would try and do a break around 5:30, but I think this is probably a good time to break because our next topic we're gonna talk about the system of federalism. We're gonna talk about the fragmentation of power vertically between national, state, and local governments and how that impacts public administration. And this is a discussion that they'll take a little bit of time. So why don't we go ahead and take a break now? And then let's say if you can come back at 5:25, we'll take about 12 minutes. Come back at 5:25, then we'll get into this discussion of federalism. Then we'll wrap up again what all this discussion means for public administration, and then we'll turn our attention to looking at the Constitution. So take a break until 5:25, come back, and we'll talk about federalism and its development. Okay, it is 5:25. We are back, and make sure we're recording. We are recording. Let's go ahead and finish up our discussion of this American government piece with a discussion of federalism. And I'll go ahead and turn my camera off to save bandwidth. But as we talked about, we have the horizontal separation of powers. We have the vertical separation through our system of American federalism. And clearly, having these different levels of government will have a major impact upon what we do as public administrators. If any of you deal with grant programs, you're very well aware of the impact that federal regulations or state regulations will have on how you spend that grant money. You may have to have reporting requirements and audit requirements that get reviewed at the state or the federal level. So without a doubt, our system of federalism makes being a public administrator here in the US different than the role of a public administrator in a more centralized, more unitary type of government. So we know federalism is this fragmentation, this division of power and responsibilities vertically across different levels of government. However, it is not a static concept. Federalism, as it was created under the Constitution, has certainly changed and evolved over the past 200 years. And that evolution then has a big impact upon what we do and how we do it as public administrators. So let's talk a bit about that development and evolution of federalism. So at the founding of the nation in the late 1780s and the Constitution in the late 1780s, up until the beginning of the Civil War, the period of federalism, the relationship between different levels of government, was usually referred to as an era of what's known as dual federalism. And by dual federalism, we mean that there is a separation between what the national government does and what state governments do. And you can see in this inset box on the right side of the slide, I've also given you some models of federalism to help explain what was going on in the relationship between the different levels of government in each one of these eras. So in dual federalism, you can see that represented here on the left in the inset box by what's known as the coordinate authority model of federalism. So we have the national government with its sphere of influence, state governments with its sphere of influence, and then, of course, local governments subsumed within the state sphere of influence. Now, in dual federalism, again, the two major levels of government were kind of doing their own thing and not interacting a lot. And that was true up through the 1830s and into the 1840s. Then things start to shift a little bit. And then we have a Northern dominated Congress passing laws that Southern states, slave states, oftentimes disagreed with because those laws would, in the minds of those Southern states, would interfere with their institution of slavery. And so throughout the 1840s and the 1850s, we saw Congress passing laws and then Southern states essentially not implementing those laws. And there were three strategies that Southern states used to try and express their displeasure with the national government. The first of those is what was known as interposition. I'll put that in text chat. What's known as interposition. Interposition is when Southern states would use their resources to try and slow down or block the implementation of a national law. So they wouldn't say that the law is unconstitutional. They would just not really implement it and try their hardest to drag their feet in implementing that law. Eventually, laws end up getting implemented. So interposition can only take Southern states so far. So then the second strategy these states use is what's called nullification. I'll put that in text chat. Nullification is what it sounds like. It's when a Southern state would just declare a national law to simply be null and void. The Congress does not have the ability, the national government does not have the constitutional ability to tell us to do this. And so therefore, we're declaring that law of Congress null and void. Eventually, when nullification didn't work, that's when we saw Southern states move to their third strategy of seceding from the Union. And this is where secession occurs. And first, we saw obviously South Carolina being the first Southern state to secede, followed then by a domino of other Southern states. In secession, the Southern states were using a seed that was planted by James Madison way back in Federalist Paper number 39. In Federalist Paper number 39, remember, as Madison deconstructs the Constitution, one of the questions he asks is this Constitution national or federal in terms of the way in which it was created? And the argument that Madison makes is it was federal because the states created the Constitution. And in essence, the states created the Union. Southern states then picked up on that and said, well, if we created the Constitution and the Union, we can then leave the Union and we can then secede from the Union. And that's the argument the Southern states made, that seceding from the Union was constitutional. Once you have secession and once you then have the Civil War from 1861 until 1865, once the Civil War is over, the entire face of this argument between national and state governments in terms of who has the power is completely changed. After the Civil War, this argument that the states created the Union, so therefore the states could secede from the Union, that argument was essentially dead. Through Reconstruction after the Civil War, we saw the national government reconstruct the South through national laws that Southern states really didn't have a lot of control over, and so we really saw the balance of power shift, and the balance of power shifted more toward the national government as opposed to state governments, and for good reasons, obviously, in the wake of the Civil War. Once we have that shift in power more toward the national government, we move to the second era of federalism that's usually called competitive federalism. And competitive federalism runs from 1865, the end of the Civil War, up until the New Deal, 1933. During this era of competitive federalism, we are still using the same approach to federalism we use in dual federalism, in that it's a coordinate authority model. Here's the national government, here are state governments, and they're doing different things. The difference, though, is in competitive federalism, the sphere of influence, the power and duties of the national government expanded greatly. And as the powers and duties of the national government expanded, they did so at the detriment of state governments. As national power expands, state power then contracted. It's kind of what's referred to in game theory as a zero-sum game. And in a zero-sum game, one party wins and one party loses. There's a total finite amount of power in the universe. So if one party is going to increase their power, they're going to do so at the detriment of the other party. So we saw the national government in the era of competitive federalism take on responsibility for a lot of additional regulatory powers, such as regulating commerce through the Interstate Commerce Commission, regulating workplace safety, regulating food safety, regulating pharmaceutical drugs, and all those things that state governments used to do. Now the federal government has started engaging in that regulation. So if you were a public administrator at that time, you traditionally would listen to the state and you would follow state regulations. Now you have to listen to the national government and follow national regulations. Then we have the stock market crash, and then FDR is elected to the White House and brings with him his New Deal policies. The New Deal was brought in to try and help state governments recover from the Great Depression. And so once FDR introduces the New Deal, we then end up shifting our era of federalism again from the competitive federalism to cooperative federalism. Some people refer to this era as fiscal federalism, but it runs from 1933 until the mid 1960s. In this era of cooperative federalism, we have now changed our model. So we are no longer in the coordinate authority model, and we have now changed over to what's called the overlapping authority model. And you can see that Venn diagram in the middle here in the inset, where the powers and duties of the different levels of government start to overlap with each other. So there are some things that national, state, and local governments all share power over. There are some things that are only national. There are some things that are only state. There are some things that are shared duties of the national and state. Some duties are shared between the national and local. And so you have these powers overlapping with each other in this overlapping authority approach to federalism. You think about the New Deal consisted of the creation of all these new federal agencies and all these new grant programs. And so now the federal government starts using grants in aid to state governments and somewhat to local governments as well to help them pull themselves out of the depth of the Great Depression. So it becomes a much more cooperative type of arrangement where the relationship between national, state, and local governments really starts to become characterized by money, by grants and aid. That era of cooperative federalism runs up until the mid 1960s and the Johnson administration. So JFK was assassinated in November of 1963. Lyndon Baines Johnson then assumes the presidency. When Johnson comes into the White House, Johnson had a couple of policy goals that he believed in very strongly, what he called the war on poverty and the Great Society. One of the things that Johnson wanted to do is Johnson wanted to reduce wealth disparities between different segments of the society. He saw a lot of wealth disparity between some segments of society compared to others. He wanted to reduce those wealth disparities. But in order to get state and local governments to come along with him and to accomplish the goals of the Great Society and the War on Poverty, he realized he needed to get kind of creative, that the old grants under the New Deal just would not work. And so that's why this era of federalism in Johnson is known as creative federalism. So in creative federalism, what Johnson tries to do is he changes the grants from being what we consider to be kind of open-ended grants without a lot of strings attached and transform them into what we refer to as categorical grants. And if you deal with categorical grants in your job, you know what a categorical grant is. A categorical grant is a very specific grant of money for a specific purpose, whereby the money can only be spent on that specific purpose. There are a lot of strings attached from the federal government, and the federal government will hold state and local governments accountable for spending the money in the way in which they are supposed to spend the money. You can see with the categorical grant, what the national government is able to do is it's able to hold state and local governments accountable for achieving national objectives. So if you're a public administrator and you're dealing with a categorical grant, you're going to have a lot more paperwork to do. You're going to have a lot more accountability requirements that you're going to have to abide by than if you had a much more general type of grant in aid. In addition to those categorical grants, when those categorical grants didn't work to get state and local compliance, that's when the Johnson administration would use mandates. And mandates are orders that the national government will give to a state or local government to take a certain type of action. The most direct mandate, as we had mentioned before, is what's called a direct order mandate. So the national government has the constitutional ability to tell a state or local government, you must take this action under the threat of civil or criminal penalties. It can issue a direct order mandate. That would be a use of overt power. However, it cannot always do that. There are some things the national government wants state and local governments to do that the national government does not have the constitutional authority to order them to do it. So another type of mandate was created known as a crossover mandate. And in a crossover mandate, the federal government says, we want you to take this action in this area. And if you don't, we're going to take money away from you in this area. So an example could be something like the Highway Beautification Act, where the national government came in and told states, we want you to clean up your highways. We want you to move billboards away from the roadway, and they had a certain minimum amount of distance between a billboard and the roadway. If you don't come into compliance with these federal orders, we're going to take highway money away from you, federal highway money away from you. That's a crossover type of mandate when the federal government doesn't have the constitutional authority, but still wants to get state and local compliance in achieving a national goal or a national objective. Other examples of some of these mandates are things such as preemptive mandates. And as we know, in the 1960s, we had a series of environmental pieces of legislation, things like the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act, that were meant to require states to clean up their water and clean up their air quality. Those acts, those federal laws, were oftentimes based upon what we call partial preemption, where the national government will come in and say, here is the new national minimum standard for water quality. Your state law must be at least as strict as this new national standard. You can go above it if you want, and you can have a stricter state standard, but your state standard must be at least as strict as the national standard. In essence, what the national government is saying is that you're not allowed to have any standard that is less strict than what the national government says. So your power in making those decisions to have less stringent standards, those powers are preempted. They have been taken away from you by the national government. So you can really see how the balance of power really shifts even more toward the national government in this creative federalism era. And if you look back at this inset box on our screen, The model on the right-hand side, what's called the inclusive authority model, that was the dominant model in this era of creative federalism. As you can see in this model, state power and local power are both subsumed within national power. So their power is now part of national power. In creative federalism, the decisions are being made in Washington, D.C., and then handed down to state and local governments. And then categorical grants and mandates were then being used to get state and local governments to come into compliance with those national objectives. So it's very much of a centralization of power in federalism. So most of the grants that you would be administering during the creative era of federalism were national grants, and you were being held accountable to very strict national standards for how those grants were to be spent. Richard Nixon comes into the White House, is inaugurated in 1969, and when Nixon comes into the White House, he has a completely opposite approach to federalism than Johnson had in creative federalism. When Nixon comes into the White House, he believes in decentralization. He wants to see power decentralized and devolve from the national government down to state and local governments. He wants to give state and local governments a lot more say in what decisions are made and how those decisions are being made. This era of federalism under Nixon is what's known as New Federalism. And then this New Federalism era under Nixon and Ford then gets a redo in the 1980s in the Reagan administration, in that Reagan had almost the exact same perspective on federalism that Nixon had. So in New Federalism, what Nixon tries to do is he eliminates a lot of these categorical grants and he replaces them with what's called general revenue sharing. And general revenue sharing is just what it sounds like. It's when the national government says, we are going to take a percentage of federal income tax revenue, and we are going to share that money with state governments with no strings attached. You essentially can spend that money however your heart desires, however you see fit. You don't have to have the accountability mechanisms that you used to have under categorical grant programs. The problem with general revenue sharing is there wasn't any revenue to share. We get to the mid 1980s, we had run a federal budget deficit every single year from 1969 to 1986. When your expenditures are exceeding your revenue, there's no money left over to then give back to states. So general revenue sharing was abolished in the Reagan administration, and it was replaced with more of a use of what are called block grants. Block grants are they kind of fall in between general revenue sharing and categorical grants. General revenue sharing, pretty much no strings attached. You can spend the federal money however you want. Categorical grants, a lot of strings attached. You have to spend it in a very specific way. Block grants are kind of in between. As long as you are spending this federal money to achieve the goals of the program, you can then select how you specifically want to spend that money. So, for instance, if you are getting national grants for the purpose of educating at-risk youth, as long as you're educating at-risk youth, then you can use it however you want. If you want to use it for computer literacy programs, you can do that. If you want to use it for after-school counseling programs, you can do that as well. Great example of a block grant is in terms of welfare reform in the 1990s. In welfare reform, we replaced the AFDC grants with these new grants known as Temporary Assistance to Needy Family Grants, or TANF grants. Those TANF grants allowed state governments to spend welfare money however they wanted, as long as the effect of it was that we were reducing welfare rolls. We were moving people from welfare to work. As long as you could prove you're moving people from welfare to work, you could spend that federal money on, again, job training programs. You can spend it on childcare programs, however you want to spend it, as long as it helped people find gainful employment. So the new federalism type of era is a lot different than creative federalism, is that it's not nearly as top down as it was in the creative era of federalism. And that takes us up to the Clinton administration in 1993 and the modern era. Today in the modern era, I think the approach to federalism is a contextual approach in that it really depends upon the issue. For some issues, we've seen the national government take the lead. In other issues, we've seen the national government step back and allow state governments to take the lead. Think about recreational use of marijuana. Marijuana still exists in the federal schedule as a drug, and so it is against federal law. But we've seen a lot of states like California and Colorado and many other states that have legalized the use of recreational marijuana. What the national government did in the Obama administration, and once again here in the Biden administration, is they've taken a step back. And they've said, we are not going to actively enforce federal marijuana law. We are going to give states space to figure it out on their own. If a state wants to legalize recreational marijuana, they can do that. We're not going to impose federal marijuana law. So it really depends upon the issues. So for some issues, the federal government has taken a hands-off approach. For some other issues, they've taken a very proactive, hands-on approach. And you'll think about in the Bush administration, G.W. Bush, the second Bush administration, we had the No Child Left Behind Act. In the No Child Left Behind Act, the national government came in and established standards for achievement that state governments had to, and local governments had to meet. If you didn't meet those achievement standards, then you would end up losing national money. That's very much of a top-down centralizing approach. So for some issues, the national government takes the lead. For other issues, they give the lead over to state and local governments. And that's kind of where we are currently in our era of federalism. That's what we call it contextual federalism. One of the things that we have seen in recent presidential elections is we kind of have this ping pong effect where we would have a Republican administration like the Bush administration, then we have the Obama administration. And the Obama administration undoes most of what the Bush administration did. Then we have a Trump administration that undoes most of what the Obama administration did. And then we have a Biden administration that comes in and tries to undo what the Trump administration did. And so we have very much this ping pong effect because we have so much partisan polarization that's currently going on in our system of politics. But the big question I like to ask in all my classes, my favorite answer, as I told you, is it depends. My favorite question is, so what? Well, what's the big so what here in terms of all these things we've talked about with separation of powers and federalism in our system of American government and what it means for our study of public administration? Well, since we limit power through both separation of powers as well as our system of federalism, it means that we as public administrators serve many masters. And this is the many masters theory of public administration. So we get direction from legislatures. We get directions from the executive branch. We get directions from the judiciary in terms of writs, as well as in writs of mandamus, as well as in terms of consent decrees and things such as that. So separation of powers, we get directives from different branches of government. In federalism, we get directives from different levels of government as well. Sometimes the regulations will come from the national government, sometimes they will come from state governments. The problem with that, obviously, for us as public administrators is when we have lots of different directions, we end up with conflicting directions. Sometimes the national government will say, you need to do this, and sometimes the state government will say, no, you need to do this. You think about here in California at the local government level, the national government may tell you, like in the Trump administration, you need to do this. And then the Newsom administration at the state level is going to come in and tell us, no, you need to do something completely opposite. When you have that type of conflicting direction, it sometimes makes it difficult for us to know as public administrators what we are supposed to do and what we are being held accountable for. Also, when you have all these different governments involved, you have a national government, you have 50 state governments, and you have literally tens of thousands of local governments. When you have all these different governments involved, it means that it creates a very complex network of both cooperation as well as competition. We know that today a lot of programs are being implemented not by a singular organization, but rather by a multitude of organizations. And so you may have a local organization at the city level that is partnering with the county, that may be partnering with a local school district, that may be partnering with an agency from the state in order to implement these programs and provide these services. So because of our system of federalism and separation of powers, we have a very complex network of these different relationships with cooperation, as well as sometimes competition. Sometimes agencies will enter into competition against each other over their turf, and you'll have turf wars between different local organizations. Oftentimes, we will have public nonprofit partnerships. We'll have public-private partnerships. And so it's really become very much a complex network. Those complex networks mean that the environment of public administration has changed over the years. So where it used to be a relatively straight line relationship between national to state to local, now the environment is much more muddied and it's much more complex. Now the relationship may go national to state, may go to a school district, then over to the city, then over to a county. So the environment of public administration has become a very complex environment. And there's a very famous public administration scholar by the name of John Gauss, who I have there on the screen for you. And he has a theory known as the ecology of public administration. His ecology of public administration essentially says that in order to understand why a public administrator does what they do, or to understand why a public organization does what it will do, you have to first understand its ecology. You have to understand the environment that surrounds it. So if you think about, if you want to look at like a house plant and you want to understand how that house plant is growing, you're going to look at its environment, the amount of sunlight that it gets, the amount of water that it gets, the amount of fertilizer that it gets, perhaps where it's placed in the house or the apartment. Some people say the amount of time that people talk to the plant will have an impact upon how much it grows. I don't know about that, but some people will say that. That's all the ecology of that house plant to understand how that house plant grows. It's the same thing here in public administration. We have to understand the totality of the entire environment ecology of which our public organizations exist. We will spend a lot of time in this class talking about environmental influences on public administration. Because again, to understand what happens in public administration, we have to first understand the environment. So tonight was our first step in understanding that environment by trying to understand the constitutional environment and the governing environment in which public organizations exist. By first understanding that constitutional and that governing environment in which organizations exist, we can then move into understand the ethical standards and the ethical environment in which public administration is done. Then we can then move on and look at the differences in the environment between public versus private organizations, and so on and so on. So this theme of the environment of public administration is something that we're going to return to each and every week as we move throughout this course. So hopefully what this has done, I know it's a lot of talking for me over the past 2 hours, but hopefully what this has done is it's kind of giving you an idea of the basics of public administration, where public administration comes from, and some of the basic foundational principles of how we understand public administrators and public organizations. But by far, one of the biggest influences that we have on our actions as public administrators is the Constitution. And this is your only chance in the entire program to really take a look at the Constitution, see what the Constitution says, and to then link it up to what we do as public administrators. So with the remainder of our time tonight, I'm not going to keep you the whole time, but I would like to go through the Constitution. I'm not going to go through every single element of the Constitution. We're not going to go through it in fine detail. But what I would like to do is kind of hit some of the high points of the Constitution and then what they mean for us as public administrators. And again, the big tie in here, the big so what question is, as public administrators with our qualified good faith immunity, we are held accountable to knowing and then not violating the constitutional rights of people we come into contact with. So it's imperative for us in an MPA program to understand what those constitutional rights are so that we can avoid violating those constitutional rights. Now, you've probably taken a look at the Constitution. I have it attached, a link to it attached on our Canvas site. Hopefully, you've taken a quick look at it. If you've looked at the Constitution recently, you realize that it is a very well organized document, and that the Constitution is organized around 7 different articles. Each one of those articles deals with a different topic. And then we have amended the Constitution 27 times. And we'll go through those 27 amendments as well. Obviously, a ton of those amendments came all at once in the Bill of Rights. So, in terms of the organization of the Constitution, Article 1, as I saw, just about everybody answered this one on the pre-assessment, that Article 1 deals with Congress, and that is true. In Article 1, we established this bicameral Congress, a Congress made up of a House of Representatives and a U.S. Senate. And that's established for us here in Article 1, Section 1 of the Constitution. Article 1, Section 2, we then deal specifically with the House of Representatives. We place limitations upon the terms of members of the House of Representatives. Members of the House only serve 2-year terms. And again, that was done by intent by the framers. They wanted people in the House of Representatives to be more accountable to the public. This is the lower house of Congress. So they serve 2-year terms. They are popularly elected. We have proportional representation in the House of Representatives. To be a member of the House, you have to be at least 25 years old. You have to have been a citizen of the United States for at least 7 years, and you must be an inhabitant of the state in which you are chosen. Later on in Article 1, Section 2 here in the next paragraph, you see some things that have obviously been removed from the Constitution by way of amendment. So we had a clause in here known as the apportionment clause, whereby taxes were apportioned according to state population. So someone may come up to you and tell you, I don't know why they would, but they may tell you, don't pay your taxes on April 15th. The federal income tax is unconstitutional. That was true under the original Constitution. However, this portion, the apportionment clause, has been removed from the Constitution with the 16th Amendment. So now the federal income tax is constitutional. But originally, taxes had to be apportioned according to state population, which meant you could not have a direct tax directly on the income of an individual citizen. The 3/5 compromise is also in here as well. That was removed, thank goodness, with the amendments to the Constitution. So we no longer have that. So those portions have been removed. Some other important parts of the House of Representatives. And the House of Representatives, we have one position that is mentioned, and that is Speaker of the House. Current Speaker of the House is Mike Johnson from the state of Louisiana. And if you watch over the past year, you saw some of the problems that the House had in arriving at a speaker designee, but we ended up with Mike Johnson from the state of Louisiana. The Speaker of the House is then second in line to the presidency after the vice president. So if the president becomes incapacitated, it goes vice president, and then the next in line is Speaker of the House. And then the next in line after that is the president pro tem of the Senate. Article 1, Section 3 turns its attention to the U.S. Senate. Senators serve 6-year terms, as we all know, and each senator has 1 vote. The Senate is a much more egalitarian type of body than the House. The House is run in a very top-down, centralized manner. The Senate is not. In the Senate, senators are considered to be equal in terms of power and authority. That's why they have almost unlimited ability to speak on the floor of the Senate. If you want to stop a member of the Senate from speaking and go ahead to consider a bill, you have to get what's called a vote of cloture, COLOTUR. Vote of cloture means you have to get 60 senators to agree in order to stop debate and then move toward the consideration of a bill. If you don't get a vote of cloture, the members can essentially stand up there, and if they want to, the past they used to read from the Washington, D.C. phone book just to kill time and keep the Senate from passing a piece of legislation. But it is the upper house, and so therefore senators serve long 6-year periods of time. You have to be at least 30 years old to be a member of the Senate. And also in the Senate, you are not directly elected under the original Constitution. Members of the Senate were selected by state legislatures. Again, that was a nod to the anti-federalists, that at least there would be a role for the states in choosing who will serve in the U.S. House of Representatives. You also have to be a citizen of the United States for at least 9 years, and again, reside in the state in which you are elected to serve. The president of the Senate is the vice president of the United States, but the vice president can only vote in the case of a tie. Vice President Kamala Harris has voted more than any of her predecessors. She set a record for the number of times that she has voted in the Senate in order to break a tie, which just again kind of underscores the fact that the Senate is very, very closely divided in terms of party affiliation. The Senate chooses their own officers, and the one officer that's mentioned here is the President pro tem of the Senate. That's currently Patty Murray from the state of Washington. Patty Murray is the President pro tem, and so is next in line for the presidency after the Speaker of the House, and ostensibly is in charge of operations of the Senate. We do know in reality, it's really the majority and minority leader that run the operations of the Senate. And so Chuck Schumer on the Democratic side is the majority leader, and then Mitch McConnell from Kentucky on the minority side, on the Republican side, is the minority leader. Functionally, they're the ones who really operate the Senate and decide what legislation gets considered. Article 1 also talks about impeachment power. The way in which impeachment works is the House of Representatives passes articles of impeachment. It's kind of similar to an indictment in the criminal justice system, and then a trial then gets held in the U.S. Senate. When a trial is held in the U.S. Senate to remove a president, you have to have a 2/3 vote. And we saw there were 2 impeachment trials for former President Trump that failed to get the 2/3 to remove President Trump. Former President Clinton also was impeached and tried in the Senate. And once again, the Senate failed to reach the 2/3 majority needed to remove him from office. The other impeachment of a president was back in the 1860s with Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson was impeached by the House. It was then tried by the Senate and survived removal from office by one singular vote. One member of the Senate changed their vote, and that's what kept him in office, or else he would have been removed from office for impeachment. Whenever the trial is held, the Chief Justice comes over and presides over the trial. So in the 2 Trump impeachments, Chief Justice Roberts presided over the trial. In the Clinton impeachment, then Chief Justice William Rehnquist presided over the trial at that time. Here's another important part, Article 1, Section 4, that we've been arguing about a bit recently, and that's the times and places and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof. But the Congress may at any time by law make or alter such regulations except as to the places of choosing senators. So this is your elections clause where states have control over their elections. However, there is a clause here that Congress may come in and change those laws if Congress does choose to do so. Again, we'll go through this a little bit quicker because I know we're kind of getting long in the tooth for our session tonight, but members get compensation for their service. There's an emoluments clause here for members of the Congress in the same way that there's an emoluments clause for the president. An emolument is money that you can earn while you were in office outside of your normal compensation, and that is prohibited for both members of Congress as well as for the president. Section 7 is an important one because all bills that raise revenue must originate in the House of Representatives. And so if it's a bill that raises taxes, it's got to start in the House before it can go over to the Senate. Also here in Section 7, we prescribe the way in which bills go through Congress and make their way to the president. Before a piece of legislation can get to the president for the president's signature, it must be first passed by the House and the Senate in identical version. Now, we know how difficult that is. Usually it'll come out of the House in one version and come out of the Senate in a different version. When that happens, we then have a conference committee, and that conference committee will then hammer out the details, send the bill back to the House and back to the Senate to pass, so that it's an identical version before it goes to the president for the president's signature or the president's veto. Article 1, Section 8 is a big one. This is the longest section we have in the Constitution, and it's also a very detailed section in that it lays out for us the enumerated powers of Congress. Congress can lay and collect taxes. Congress can borrow money, and Congress has become very good at borrowing money, much to all of our chagrin. It can regulate commerce. This is a huge one. Whenever Congress tries to expand its power over state governments, it usually does it using this clause, which is called the Commerce Clause, the ability to regulate commerce between the states. Can coin money, just go through this quickly, punish counterfeiters, establish post offices, constitute tribunals inferior to the Supreme Court. That means that Congress had the ability to establish the entire federal judiciary with the exception of the Supreme Court. The only court mentioned in Article 3 of the Constitution is the Supreme Court. All other courts inferior to the Supreme Court were created by Congress in the Judiciary Act. The ability to declare war, the ability to raise and support armies, to provide and maintain a navy, to call forth the militia, exercise legislation in all cases whatsoever over the District of Columbia. And so Congress has control over the District of Columbia. And then you get to this elastic clause we mentioned before, to make all laws that shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested in the United States or any department of officer thereof. In other words, Congress can do anything it considers to be necessary in order to be able to carry out all those powers that have been enumerated earlier in Article 1, Section 8. This is your big compromise here between Federalists and Anti-Federalists. Anti-Federalists got powers enumerated. Federalists got this necessary and proper clause. There are limitations to what Congress can do. Those limitations come in the form of Article 1, Section 9. This first one is this no banning of the slave trade until 1808, which was the compromise between slave and non-slave states. Congress cannot suspend writ of habeas corpus, which is literally to present the bodies. So if someone is arrested, you can't take them and hide them away somewhere and not say where that person is, unless in a case of rebellion. And so we saw the writ of habeas corpus was suspended during the Civil War because it was a rebellion. No bills of attainder. A bill of attainder is basically to declare someone guilty without the benefit of a trial. No ex post facto laws. An ex post facto law is an after the fact law. So you do something yesterday and it was legal, then today Congress passes a law to make it illegal, and then you get prosecuted for doing it when it was legal yesterday. You can't have that type of ex post facto after the fact type of law. And again, just to cherry pick here, in Article 1, Section 9, you'll see that paragraph second from the bottom, no money shall be drawn from the Treasury, but in consequence of appropriations. This is important because it means that Congress must first appropriate money before it can spend money. Appropriations is a process of merely saying, this is how we are spending the money. So Congress must say how it's spending it before it can take the money from the Treasury. That's why we have an appropriations process in the creation of the federal budget. Then in Article 1, Section 10, we get into limitations on state governments. States cannot enter into treaties. We know that treaties are entered into by the president with the advice and consent of the Senate. States cannot enter into treaties or alliances or confederations. They also cannot coin money. They cannot issue what are called letters of marque and reprisal. Letter of marque and reprisal is just when the government says, you can take your boat and go out there and attack boats from other countries. That's a letter of marque and reprisal. So you're not allowed to do that. No bills of attainder, no titles of nobility, just like the limitation that is placed upon Congress. So we have some limitations on what, we won't go through them all, but limitations of what states can do. So in Article 1, Section 9, limitations on Congress. Article 1, Section 10, limitations upon the powers of state governments. Article 2 then speaks to the executive branch and the powers of the presidency. We know that the president serves 4-year terms in office. We know the president is selected by the Electoral College. You're all familiar with some of the controversy we've had over the Electoral College recently. Our Electoral College is made up of 538 electors. You need to get a majority of those 270 in order to be elected president. We have certainly had situations in our past where candidates have failed to get a majority of the Electoral College. When you fail to get a majority of the Electoral College, the presidential election is then shifted over into the House of Representatives. The House of Representatives will then select the president, with each congressional delegation having 1 vote. So presidents are selected through this Electoral College. We also know that presidents have certain duties and powers that are assigned to them here in Section 2. Presidents are commander in chief of the Army and Navy. This was obviously important to the framers. They wanted to make sure you had a civilian in charge of the standing Army and Navy, obviously the standing Army and Navy that we did not have under the Articles of Confederation. Presidents can make appointments to vacancies. They can appoint people. Some of those positions are then subject to confirmation by the U.S. Senate. They also can enter into treaties with the advice and consent of the U.S. Senate. George Washington entered into his first treaty when he was president and actually hand delivered the treaty to the Senate and sat on a bench outside the Senate while the Senate considered the treaty. He thought the Senate would just rubber stamp it because he was George Washington after all. And he thought advice and consent just basically meant reviewing it and then giving it back to the president. Several hours later, someone came out and said, Mr. President, we may have to take another day or two to debate this treaty. That really infuriated Washington so much that he got up, he stormed out, and he never went back and visited the Senate again. But the Senate does take its role of advising consent on these types of treaties very, very seriously and always has. So presidents entering these treaties, presidents are essentially commander-in-chief, they're chief diplomat, they're chief of state, and they're also chief legislator in that presidents have the ability to recommend legislation to Congress. We don't think about that a whole lot. We think that Congress passes bills and then the president is in charge of executing that legislation. But presidents do have the ability to recommend legislation to Congress, and we see that happen. We've seen that happen frequently in the Biden administration. Presidents can be impeached and removed from office, as we had talked about before in Section 4. President, Vice President, all civil officers of the United States shall be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, and other high crimes and misdemeanors. This is what we argue a lot about, is what do the framers mean by high crimes and misdemeanors? This is why there's a very high bar for removing someone from office based upon impeachment. Article 3 is a very short article. It only talks about the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is the only court that is created under Article 3 of the Constitution. All other courts inferior were created by Congress in the Judiciary Act. In Article 3, we don't lay out any requirements to be a member of the Supreme Court. We know in order to be in the House of Representatives, you have to be 25 and you have to be a citizen for 7 years. In order to be in the Senate, you have to be at least 30 years old. In order to be president, you have to be at least 35 years old and be a natural born citizen. So we have requirements for all those positions. There are no requirements spelled out by the framers to be a member of the Supreme Court. However, we do spell out the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has both original as well as appellate jurisdiction. So cases that have a direct impact upon the Constitution that oftentimes are very time sensitive have the ability technically to go to the court first, to go to the Supreme Court first. That is extremely unusual. The vast majority of cases make their way up to the Supreme Court by being appealed from lower courts. So 99.9999% of all cases go to the Supreme Court on appellate type of jurisdiction. Article 4, a couple of important things here. The full faith and credit clause in Article 4, Section 1, that every state must give full faith and credit to the laws of other states, meaning that states must respect the laws passed by other states. All citizens of each state shall be entitled to all privileges and immunities of citizens in the several states. New states may only be admitted if they are admitted to the Union by Congress. So Congress is the only one that can determine if new states will be admitted into the Union. And in Section 4, the United States shall guarantee to every state in the Union a Republican form of government. Again, this is a Republican form of government guaranteed in each and every state. And you will notice here's another instance of the United States here in the Constitution being used as a proper noun, as opposed to how the phrase was used in the Articles of Confederation. Article 5 lays out for us how we amend the Constitution, so it does not have to be a unanimous agreement of all the states. There are 4 ways to amend the Constitution. The first way to amend the Constitution is with proposal by 2/3 of the House and the Senate, and then ratification by 3/4 of state legislatures. That is the only way in which we have ever amended the Constitution. We have never used another approach. Proposed by 2/3 of the House and the Senate, and then ratified by 3/4 of state legislatures. But there are three other ways in which we can amend the Constitution if we choose to. The second way is proposed by 2/3 of the House and the Senate, and then ratified by 3/4 of state constitutional conventions. The third way is to have 2/3 of the states petition Congress for a national constitutional convention, and then any amendments that come out of that national constitutional convention would then be ratified by 3/4 of state legislatures. And then the fourth and final way, 2/3 of the states petition Congress for a national constitutional convention, and then those amendments that come out of that convention are then ratified by 3/4 of state constitutional conventions. Obviously, we are oftentimes scared to death of having a constitutional convention because we saw what happened at the last one. And so therefore, we usually avoid those last three approaches, and we always use the first approach to amend the Constitution. Very important part of Article 6 is Article 6, paragraph number 2. The Constitution, laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof, and all treaties made and which shall be made under the authority of the United States, shall be the supreme law of the land. This is your supremacy clause. This is your very strong declaration of national government power. So this is very much your federalist part of the Constitution. And then Article 7 just talks about how the Constitution is ratified by 9 out of 13 states. As we mentioned before, in order to get that ratification by the state of New York, we had to immediately amend the Constitution 10 times through the Bill of Rights. And you're familiar with many of these amendments. First Amendment, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of peaceable assembly. Now, these are rights that you have. These are your civil liberties. However, there can be certain limitations placed upon them. Think about religion. Religion is broken up into two clauses, establishment and free exercise. Establishment means that Congress may establish no religion, meaning that you are free to believe any religion that you want to believe in. That's completely up to you, and the Congress cannot stop you from believing what you want to believe. However, there can be limitations placed upon the exercise of your religion. If the way in which you exercise your religion places a detriment or perhaps harm to public safety, then there can be limitations on that exercise. Same thing with freedom of speech. You cannot yell fire in a crowded theater because of the risk it poses to public safety. Same type of thing with right of people to peaceably assemble. You have a right to assembly, but sometimes your government will require you to get a permit before you can peaceably assemble. So there are some limitations that can be applied. We're all very familiar with the Second Amendment, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. We argue about this one all the time in terms of gun control legislation. Some factions will say that this is pretty much a blanket provision that everyone can own guns. Other factions will say that gun ownership is for the purpose of maintaining a well-regulated militia. We won't get into that here in this class tonight, but sometimes if you do want to know what the framers meant by what they write, it's a good idea to go back and look at the Federalist Papers. And Hamilton and a couple of the different Federalist Papers wrote about what he meant by a well-regulated militia, actually talking about the number of times per year that a militia should meet in order to be considered to be well-regulated. So it's always good to read the Federalist Papers to understand what the framers mean by what they write. Third Amendment is no quartering of soldiers. You cannot be required to quarter soldiers in your home. This is one of your privacy rights, privacy protections. Fourth Amendment is your protection against unwarrantable search and seizure. This is why police have to get a search warrant approved by a judge before they can search your property. Some more of your criminal justice protections are here in the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution. The Fifth Amendment to the Constitution, there's your indictment provision that you have to be indicted by a grand jury. Your double jeopardy protection that you cannot be tried twice for the same crime, and you cannot be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Those are some of your criminal justice protections. Sixth Amendment provides you with some more criminal justice protections: the right to a speedy and public trial, the right to an impartial jury of your peers, the right to have counsel in your defense. And so through Miranda versus Arizona, this is why you have your Miranda rights and you are Mirandized whenever you are arrested. Seventh Amendment gives you the right to a jury trial in a civil case that is worth more than $20. So it kind of dates the Constitution to the late 1700s. Eighth Amendment, there's no excessive bail and no cruel or unusual punishment. So these are the death penalty questions and issues that we argue over with the Eighth Amendment. Ninth Amendment, the enumeration of the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or deprive others retained by the people. 10th Amendment, the Reserve Powers Amendment, the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. Again, the 9th Amendment, the 10th Amendment were certainly added on in order to try and help with some of the concerns the anti-federalists had that the Constitution was creating too strong of a national government that would tread upon not only states' rights, but also tread upon the rights of individuals. Now, with the Bill of Rights, there's an important concept associated with the Bill of Rights known as incorporation. Incorporation is a term that refers to extending these protections to include limitations against state government actions as well. Originally, the Supreme Court looked at these protections in the Bill of Rights and said these are protections against the national government, and did not extend them to include protections against state governments. And let me give you one very painful example of that. And I'll try and do it very quickly. But in the Fifth Amendment, you have this protection against double jeopardy, that you cannot be tried for the same crime twice. There was an individual in the state of Connecticut by the name of Frederick Palko. And Palko was tried by the state of Connecticut on first-degree murder charges. He was found guilty of second-degree murder. The state of Connecticut was not happy with that. They wanted him convicted of first-degree murder. So they then retried him again, the exact same crime, the exact same details of the case. And that second time, they got him convicted of first-degree murder and given the death penalty. Palko obviously complained and said, this is a violation of my Fifth Amendment protections. Case went up to the Supreme Court in a case called Palko versus Connecticut in 1937. Supreme Court said, we are sorry, Mr. Palko, but your Fifth Amendment protections only apply to the national government. They do not apply to the state of Connecticut. It was not until 1968, over 30 years later, in a case called Benton versus Maryland, that the Supreme Court finally incorporated these protections against double jeopardy to include limitations against state governments as well as the national government. So that whole process of incorporation took many, many years for it to happen. It happened too late for Mr. Palko, obviously, which is certainly a very sad story. But now a lot of these rights have been incorporated to include limitations against state governments as well as the national government. And just very quickly to run through the rest of the amendments, 11th Amendment basically just limits the judicial power of the federal government in terms of cases brought by states against other states. The 12th Amendment changed the system where the person who came in second became vice president. The controversy we had between Thomas Jefferson and his vice president, Aaron Burr. So Jefferson championed the 12th Amendment, so the vice president would no longer become the person who came in second in the presidential election. 13th Amendment outlaws slavery. The 14th Amendment provides us with the Equal Protection Clause. Again, more incorporation of these protections to include state governments as well as the national government. There's been a lot of talk about the 14th Amendment in terms of the 14th Amendment, Section 3, and the insurrection clause, that anyone who is engaged in insurrection can be prohibited from holding an office. And there's a lot of discussion of that with the cases that are being brought in terms of ballot access for former President Trump. 15th Amendment says you may not deprive the right to vote based upon race, color, or previous condition of servitude. 16th Amendment authorizes a direct federal income tax, so you have to pay your taxes now. The 18th Amendment was prohibition of, 17th Amendment, let's jump to the 18th. The 17th Amendment made for the popular election of senators. So senators would no longer be selected by state legislatures, but they would now be popularly elected. 18th Amendment was prohibition. 19th Amendment was women's suffrage. 20th Amendment changed the terms of president and members of Congress, moving them from March up to January, so you wouldn't have so much intervening time between an election and when people took office. 21st Amendment undoes the 18th Amendment and undoes prohibition. 22nd Amendment establishes 2-term limits for presidents. 23rd Amendment gives 3 electoral college votes to the District of Columbia. 24th Amendment eliminates poll taxes, a device that was being used by southern states for disenfranchisement of certain members of their population, primarily racial discrimination. 25th Amendment provides a process by which the vice president can declare the president incapacitated and then take over the duties of the president. Vice president can do that either with the concurrence of a majority of the cabinet or can do that with a majority of a committee established by Congress. 26th Amendment provides the right to vote to 18, 19, and 20-year-olds. And then finally, the 27th Amendment, ratified in 1992, was supposed to be part of the Bill of Rights, authored by James Madison, that no law varying compensation for services of senators and representatives shall take effect until the election of representatives shall have intervened. So you must stand for election before you can get the fruits of your labor and get this raise that you approve for yourself. The reason why this amendment, which was written back in 1791, was able to then be added to the Constitution 200 years later is it didn't have a sunset provision. Most amendments have a sunset provision that says if this amendment is not ratified within 7 years, it is then null and void. They didn't have that back in the 1790s, and there was no sunset provision. And so a student in the state of Texas wrote a paper on how this was still a viable amendment. I believe he got a C- on the paper, but undeterred went out there and started a national movement to get the amendment ratified. And lo and behold, got it ratified on May 7th, 1992, and it became the 27th Amendment to the Constitution. So we've only amended the Constitution 27 times, and 10 of those times were all done at once in the Bill of Rights. Contrast that to the California State Constitution. California State Constitution has been amended over 500 times. And the way we amend the California Constitution is different than how we amend the federal Constitution. See, with the federal Constitution, we add those amendments at the end of the Constitution. In the California Constitution, we make the amendments directly into the relevant sections of the state constitution. So we go in there and we change the wording directly in the Constitution. That's why if you look at the California Constitution, you're not going to see a list of 500 amendments at the end. Those amendments have changed the text of the Constitution after each one of those amendments have been passed by the voters. So that's the difference between the national constitution and the California Constitution. Obviously, we have a bicameral legislature here in the state of California, modeled after what we have at the federal level. We have a state assembly and we have a state senate. The sizes of the assembly and the Senate are smaller than the sizes of the House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate. Here in California, our California State Assembly has 80 seats. Our California State Senate has 40 seats. Both of those bodies are controlled by the Democratic Party. The Democrats controlled 62 out of 80 seats in the General Assembly, and they control 32 out of 40 seats in the California State Senate. So they certainly have supermajorities in both houses of the legislature. Add into that a Democratic governor, and you have very much one-party Democratic control here in the state of California. as opposed to what you see at the federal level, where you typically have divided government, where you'll have the Republicans control the House, the Democrats control the Senate, and currently a Democrat sitting in the White House. But again, this is not the only time we really have a chance to take a look at the Constitution. Again, to reiterate, the Constitution is important to us as public administrators because we need to know what the Constitution says about the rights of people that we come into contact with. If we are knowingly or even unknowingly violating the rights of people we come into contact with, we could lose our qualified good faith immunity. In the past, government employees had sovereign immunity in that they were working for a government, that government was sovereign, and so therefore they could not be held liable for their actions. Now your immunity is more qualified good faith. If you are taking actions within the parameters of your job and you are not violating the constitutional rights of people you come into contact with, then you have immunity from prosecution. But it's very important that we understand what those constitutional rights are and then endeavor not to violate those constitutional rights. Now, I know we went through the Constitution very, very quickly, but I, again, think this is the only forum that you'll have to look at the Constitution. And it is so elemental to our entire system of public administration and what we do as public administrators. It's imperative that we at least take some time tonight and see what the Constitution says about the rights of people that we deal with on a daily basis. So that is our preliminary information on American government and the Constitution and what that information then means for our work as public administrators in the public sector. The goal of tonight, again, was just to create this common playing field for everyone, regardless of the amount of prior coursework you've had in American government. Now we all have a good working understanding of American government and the Constitution, which will then allow us to build upon that as we move into next week and start talking about some of our ethical and accountability requirements that we have as public administrators. So let me break there and ask, are there any questions about this information? I know I've talked a lot tonight, and I warned you about that last week. Just a lot of information to cover this evening. It really becomes kind of lecture oriented. I apologize for that. Future courses, future class sessions will have a lot more discussion. And I do want to start incorporating some breakout groups into some of our future sessions as well. So hopefully tonight was a little atypical for how most of our class sessions will go. But any questions or clarifications or anything on this information? Okay. Then when we get together next week, in the first half of class, we have Kelly Janicek coming in as a guest from the library. She'll spend an hour and a half talking about how to do research in public administration, as well as talking about how you cite sources in APA. Once Kelly is done next week, we'll then take a brief break. Then the second half of class, we will start talking about accountability and ethics in the public sector. Remember, you have your first graded Canvas essay that is due by midnight next Monday. If you have any questions at all about that, feel free to reach out to me, send me an email. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have. I'm looking for concise, parsimonious answers. And so your response to my initial prompt, maybe 2 or 3 paragraphs, your response to 2 of your classmates, maybe a paragraph each, and that would certainly be sufficient. Okay. Okay, I promised you to get out early. We're going to get out about 10 minutes early tonight, so I did not lie to you. But again, any questions at all, send me an email. Otherwise, I look forward to reading your Canvas essays, and we'll be back at it again next Monday with Kelly Janicek and then accountability and ethics. So take care, everyone. Have a great week, and I'll talk to you next week.
Take care. Thank you.
Thank you very much.